Tonight is Daniel 9:24 through 27. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy. As we start over, our scripture reading tonight is Daniel 9:24 through 27. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Thank you.
Very good. I'm very sorry. Tom has gotten so good back there. He can get into a program that he could tell how I'm working all week when stuff goes up on the program. And now he's even bringing in my scripture readings and everything. And so he does such a good job. We're so thankful for him. That he had a scripture reading before I did. So very good. And you did a good job reading it too. If your comrade would have just gave you the right chapter. Yeah, I know it. Now I need to find the right passage. Now, none of you remember me preaching this. Hey, there's Derek back there. It's good to have you back, buddy. If you have any questions, Derek is the professional on the 70 weeks of Daniel. So if you have any questions, you can ask him. I don't even know. We may not all agree on the view that is taken here. I know that that it's not something that is often talked about. But I'll tell you, in the denominational world, they talk a lot about the Daniel and his 70 weeks, and they believe that it is yet to be fulfilled, and numerous times there'll be, or at all different times, people will come out with a book, and I mean, just type in Daniel 70 weeks on the internet and see what you find. Right now, you've got people interpreting Daniel's 70 week through the lens of the newspaper, and they've got Putin as the villain. So it seems like any time there's something that happens, this is brought up. Now, this is a chart, and it's a very good chart. You can't read it. I already know that, so don't say anything. But maybe you can make it out. The reason I wanted to bring it up is because he gives these dates right here. And there were edicts that were given to send the children of Israel back from their captivity when they came back to Jerusalem after the 70 years were up. And he has this one here first, which he says, this return, it's in 539 BC. This return followed the decree of Cyrus and Ezra. Cyrus is the king we mentioned this morning. You remember we were talking about the Medo-Persians, and Cyrus was the horn that was a little bit bigger. There's 2 horns on that ram, He was the bigger horn. The next he has in 458, which is Artaxerxes, 457 to 458, Artaxerxes' decree, which is the second decree. And then he has 445 BC, which is Artaxerxes' second decree. Now then, he has these years. He takes us all the way out to the end of the 70 weeks, and he adds them up. And if you go from Cyrus's first decree, you come to what looks like 608 years. If you go from Artaxerxes' first decree, you have 527 years. And if you go from his second decree, you have 514 years. He takes that all the way out to the end of the 70 weeks. All right? And so you know a number of 490. And what he is proposing is that none of these add up to 490. I'm going to try to debunk that. All right? Although I don't have a great deal of a problem with it, I just don't see the need well, you don't have to argue too much. I guess a little bit of arguing doesn't hurt. I try to get Laura to argue with me all the time. I can barely get her to do it. So we may end up arguing over it. But again, I think it makes a great deal of sense. In Luke chapter 2, the Bible points out, in the days of these kings, and he is quoting Daniel. The question is, if this was a times table, now do you all remember this chart? Do you remember me going over this? Have you ever seen this chart before, ever? Now, Laura and Randy are saying, I preached this here. You all must have just been asleep that night. But I drew this, the girls painted it, I took a picture of a chart like that, and this is a hybrid between charts and PowerPoint. And so I think you could read that pretty well. I think even Tommy over there could read that. Very good. So the 490 years, which I'm going to try to show you, does take us to the end. But remind me, or I will forget, to give you my argument, which is opposed to those long, long years, okay? So I'll just simply get into the text. I believe this to be the return of Ezra in 457, 458 BC. This is Artaxerxes' first edict. It is not Cyrus's first edict, but Artaxerxes. The reason I say this is because we realize in the New Testament that they were looking for the fulfillment of Daniel's 70 weeks. We know that Luke mentions the days of these kings, and we know that they knew something about it. In Matthew 24, Jesus reaches back and quotes from this chapter in speaking of certain things that were going to happen. We know that it was on their mind, the book of Daniel. And we know that they were calculating how many years. And I believe that if they had taken the years and calculated them, they would come up to the period of Jesus' ministry. And so it wasn't a secret. I will suggest to you that the cataclysmic event that is prophesied in this chapter is determined in the last week, but it's not part of the time chart. It is just simply determined. We'll look a little bit more about that later. Now then, you'll find this return in Ezra chapter 7, verses 6 through 7, and Zechariah chapter 8, verses 4 through 5. But in this time period, the first of the time period, notice verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. Now, it is done to finish a transgression, to make an end of sin, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. 70 weeks. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem under the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. Here is our first part of the prophecy. 7 weeks. This begins with Jerusalem being rebuilt, and it goes all the way notice here what is next. You have silent years. This 70 weeks, or this 7 weeks, and then you have 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So here then you have these silent years. What we are doing is we are reckoning weeks with years. Okay? So 7 weeks in the book of Daniel stands for 49 years. In 49 years, in the span of this, you will see the return, you will see Jerusalem being rebuilt, and then it says there is 62 weeks. What is 60? 60, and 2 weeks is 2. So you add that up, you have 434 years. Okay? Now then, he goes on and he says, verse 26, after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince shall come and shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war of desolation are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. This then is where we get this 1 week. Now in this week, there are certain things that happen. Notice here then, the first thing that will happen is he will finish transgression. What does that mean? How did Jesus finish transgression? At the cross, his blood saved mankind from their sin. Notice the second thing. It makes an end of sin. Now, you might say, well, sin didn't end. But what this is pointing to is an end of sacrifices that are needed to take care of sin. Jesus' sacrifice on the cross brought an end to the power of sin over mankind. In this week, he will make reconciliation. The word reconciliation, or the idea of reconciliation, is to make friends again. Man was separated from God. Why? Because of his sins. Something had to be done to bind that friendship together again. This happens in this week here. Another thing that happens, everlasting righteousness. When Jesus saved us on the cross, how long did that salvation last? Forever. These seem fairly simple, do they not? To seal up the vision and the prophecy. When this happened, there was an end of something that was coming. We looked this morning in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9. And do you remember when it said, for a New Testament to come, the testator had to die? And so there is a transition of covenants. In this week, Jesus is anointed as the Most High, which was prophesied in Daniel chapter 7. Now then, in the midst of the week, did you notice what it said? Verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Verse 27, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblations to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now then, in verse 25, notice it says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. There we are speaking of Jesus. If you go down into verse 26, did you notice that there are 2 people that are being spoken of? And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off. That is one person. But not for himself. And the people of the, what does it say? This is another person. In verse 25, the Messiah is called the Prince. Here you have in this passage the Messiah being spoken of, who was called the Prince earlier. But there is another person. The people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. All right, someone said Titus. You're getting way ahead of us. But that's the answer that I think it is. And again, there is some question concerning it. But one of the things that I found out when I was studying this is people do not make a distinction between those two people. They see Prince in verse 25, all right? And then they see Prince in verse 26, and they think it's the same person. But it's almost like he changed identity if he's the same person. In verse 25, he's Prince. In verse 26, he's the artist formerly known as Prince. Is that what we're saying? If you know anything about rock and roll, there you go. But it's not the same person. And a clear reading of the text shows you that we're not speaking of the same person here. We're speaking of a different prince. Now then, in this week, we find the crucifixion of Christ. This week can be split up into 3.5 by 3.5. Okay? Now, whenever you read the book of Revelation, you hear a lot of people talk about the Great Tribulation. You ever heard that? How long does the Great Tribulation last in the premillennial doctrine? 7 years. Okay? Now then, here we find that being the case in this chapter. 7 years. And it is divided into 3.5. In that 3.5 years, you have the crucifixion of Christ. You have, let me see here. You have Jesus' public ministry. You have him being baptized in AD 26, which brings us to our lesson. In the midst of the week, he's cut off. How is he cut off? What does that symbolize? That symbolizes his crucifixion, doesn't it? Sacrifice and oblation ceases at that point. Okay? Now, did the sacrifice and the oblation cease in the temple? That's right, Marley. No. The temple still existed when Jesus was crucified. As a matter of fact, it existed approximately 40 years afterwards, right? A whole generation would pass until 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. How then does sacrifice and oblation cease in the midst of the week because of the crucifixion? It is simple. No sacrifice will ever cover sins again once Jesus has been crucified. There is no need for any sacrifices or oblation. Every sacrifice that was made in the temple of the Jews after Jesus' crucifixion was just a vain, useless sacrifice. It covered nothing. They simply went through the motions. During the last part of this, we see the church being established. I don't know why I brought that D down there. We see the stoning of Stephen. We see the Gentiles being added to the church. Now then, I'm going pretty quick for you. You guys might get out of here really quick. I don't think anyone will have a problem with that. Laura's saying yes, that would be wonderful. Okay, let's look at this last verse. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Here, the last 3.5, you see it culminates in the stoning of Stephen and the preaching to the Samaritans. Paul was converted in 33 to 34 AD, Acts 8 in verse 1. But what is the end? In verse 27a, the Messiah or the Messianic covenant replaces the former covenant. In verse 27b, notice here, for the overspreading of abomination, he shall make it desolate. This is what Jesus said, isn't it? When you see the abomination of desolation. Now, does that happen in this last week? No, it doesn't. So how do we get 490 years out of this then? There is a word that is used. Notice he says, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. That which is determined in the last week shall be poured upon the desolate. The time frame ends in the last week, and we can add it up. 490 years brings us to the establishment of the church. It brings us to the spreading of the gospel. That is the last week. But did you notice the word that is used in that section? The end, that is the overspreading of the abominations, he shall make it desolate, even to the consummation. The end is determined in that week. Jesus said, you will know when this is happening. He called it the abomination of desolation. Did he say that? He said, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you see these things happening, you will know the end is near. But of that day and hour, what did he say? Knoweth no man. Only God does. Why did he give all of these pictures in Matthew 24 concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, but then he says of that day and hour knows no man? Because in this chapter, all of the time frame is given up to his crucifixion, up to his public ministry, up to his baptism, up to the founding of the church, up to the spread of the gospel. But it does not give the time period of when the destruction of Jerusalem will happen. It is in that last week that it is determined. And Jesus follows that and says, of that day and hour knoweth no man. Why? Because the scripture did not give the time frame for the actual destruction. And so then, going back to that first chart, he gave a good idea. Well, he gave the numbers very well. He takes the numbers from Cyrus's decree, and he goes all the way to the end of the destruction of Jerusalem. He adds 40 years on to the last week, which to me seems ridiculous, because in his PDF, he argues that the premillennialists add 2,000 years to the last week. Let me ask you a question. The fulfillment of the last week, if we add 40 years to it, or we add 2,000 years to it, what is the difference? We are still adding years to it. Now, why do I hit Artaxerxes' decree? Because I add up the weeks and it comes to 490. Then I go back and look at history. If I take the establishment of the Lord's church and I go back 490 years, where does that bring me? That brings me to 457. Exactly 490 years. Now, if the time doesn't matter, then why did Daniel tell them to add up the years and be waiting for the fulfillment if the time doesn't matter? History shows us that one of these numbers fits, and that number is 490. And so, during this time, the people of the prince shall come. Chester mentioned that prince is Titus. Okay? In Daniel chapter 7, I believe Titus was the one that wore out the saints. All right? You remember the prophecy of the 10 horns. He's the one that seems to fit for me. Daniel, I think, is indicating that the destruction of Jerusalem is determined, and the little horn, not to be confused with Daniel chapter 8. You guys are going to, if you're like me, you're going to get completely confused with all the horns and little horns and big horns. The little horn in chapter 7 is different than the little horn in chapter 8. If we add up all the Caesars, if you begin with Julius Caesar, you have Augustus next, then you have Tiberius, then you have Caligula, then you have Claudius, then you have Nero, then you have Gabla, then you have Athos, then you have Vitalian, and then you have Vespasian. That is 10 horns, and then you have a little horn. You know who comes after? Titus. Why would Titus in chapter 7 be called the little horn? Because when Titus destroyed Jerusalem, he was not a Caesar. He was put in place by Vespasian, who was the big horn. And so, the size of the horn is different. He is not one of the big horns. He is not one of the Caesars. He would ultimately become the next Caesar after Vespasian, but when Jerusalem is destroyed, he is still yet a wee horn at that point. But he wears out the saints. And that brings you to your 11 horns. If you want to add 12 horns, just for posterity's sake, the next man is Domitian. And Domitian is the one that most people would suggest is the little horn, chapter 8. And many people would suggest that he is the prince here that he's being spoken of. But Domitian was not around, was not an emperor when Jerusalem was destroyed. And so I feel it to be Titus. Now then, Titus is the prince that shall come. He shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, make war and desolation. We see the fall of Jerusalem. And in that last part of the 70 weeks, the last week of the 70 weeks, that is when it is determined. Did you notice that he doesn't extend it any more years? He simply says it is determined. And because I believe that all of Matthew 24 is speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that day and hour that Jesus speaks of, I believe to be the destruction of Jerusalem. And he said, knoweth no man. Why would no man know it? Because in Daniel chapter 9, there wasn't a date attached to it. And so this is why I fall upon 490 years. Now, with that being said, I don't have a problem with however many years you want to make it. If you do not think the year of the decree matters, and you want to go with one of those three, or if you want to go with something else, that's all right. I do have a problem, like I said, when you try to fit things into a year. By the way, the premillennialists, that last week has been over 2,000 years. They follow it pretty good till they get to there. And how can they add 2,000 years, you might ask? Here's what they say. When Jesus looked over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, oh, Jerusalem," I would have been as a mother hen who gathers her chicks, but you would not. They say it was at that moment that Jesus changed his plans. His plan was to come and start the kingdom in his lifetime. But because Jerusalem rejected him, he pulled what is called in football an audible, right on the line. It was blue 24 for the longest time, or Daniel 490 for the longest time. But when he saw that Jerusalem rejected him, he pulled an audible. Now, what is an audible? I know you know, Laura, because you know so much about football, but I'll go ahead and explain it. It's when you change the plan, right there on the line. And so they say that he installed the church, the age of grace. And the church was never in the plan of God, but that he changed it on the line. And when the church age is over, the consummation of his ministry will happen, and he will usher in the kingdom. All right? Okay. Any questions, comments, gripes, complaints, or criticisms at this point? Got some interesting faces. Do you remember this sermon now yet? Still don't. I'll tell you what. We even record them. What do you think, Marley? I think I'll quit there. See, Derek, I can get one done in about 20 minutes. How about that? We want to offer an invitation. Why is prophecy like this important? If I go forward, we can go right into the song, right? Yes, we can. Why is prophecy like this important? Well, I mentioned it this morning. It bolsters our faith. We can see the fulfillment of prophecy. I could think of so many that have strengthened me. I would like to go through the prophecy of the destruction of the city of Tyre and use the Bible, the Old Testament, and I'll tell you what, every passage was fulfilled. Every minute detail was fulfilled. I feel the same way about Matthew 24. The very minute details in Matthew 24 were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. And I think so many people miss the strength for their faith that comes from these type of passages. We want to encourage you tonight, if you need help with your faith,